Remember when I said Iceland never disappoints? Well, it's epic from coast to coast.
We're here in the western part of the Snæfellsnes Peninsula, the Londrangar cliffs here behind me. We're here just past sunrise, so it's like 10:35 a.m. We're getting ready to capture these cliffs and this great landscape behind me. With landscape photography, it really depends on the quality of the light. And that's why we're really getting up early, focusing on sunrises, and coming out early to focus on sunsets. Sometimes, no matter what we do or where we prepare to be, we don't exactly get what we want. So today, I positioned ourselves so the sun would rise off this way, and hopefully as the sun comes up, it would cast some light on these rocks behind me. But since it's pretty much a completely overcast sky today, the sun never came through and we're stuck with really flat-looking conditions. So today is going to be all about trying to make a really cool composition that doesn't really necessarily focus on the sky too much, but focuses on this incredible coastline instead. Comparing this location to, let's say, that shoot we did at Kirkjufell with the big conical-shaped mountain, that scene had everything that we were looking for. It had a really great sky, it had really great foreground interest, it pretty much had every quality of a great photo. This situation is a little bit different because we don't have the support for the sky, we don't really have a lot of texture or a lot of light. So we're going to try some different techniques to try to get the most out of this shot. And one of the things that we're going to focus on today is really controlling the exposure time to try to soften the water. Since we have a really flat sky today, we're going to go over some tricks to make the best out of the compositions that we can have, and maybe even go over some things that are often overlooked by photographers. So really today, the key is making the best out of the composition and using as much of the foreground and the cliff face as possible. So what I'm going to do, while the camera's in video mode, I'm going to frame up some really cool compositions that we can look at together. So now that I'm set up right here, right in the middle, I'm going to work on a few compositions that I like, that I think work really well, and I'm also going to show you a few that don't. So right now I'm shooting with a 16 to 35. That really covers the whole aspect of wide angle, from very wide to sort of a medium wide at 35. Gives me the ability to really scout this area and experiment. So the first thing I like to do when I come up to a scene like this is start as wide as possible. So with this shot that we're looking at right now, I really like to be able to see this big rock right in the foreground. And what I mean by the entire thing is that I have water washing under it. I'm not really cropping it at all. The other thing, earlier I said a little bit about the sky being sort of flat and uninteresting. There's a little tiny bit of definition, but there's really no reason to focus on the sky. So for a wide angle shot, this works really nicely, and what I wouldn't do is move the camera up too high. So if we change the composition here, I like the foreground elements. I like how that rock off to the left is sort of in the bottom left corner, but I don't like the sky. It really is not interesting at all. In fact, it's flat with no detail. So in this case, for a wide shot, I really want to find a comfort zone where I can address and show the water and also the detail of the water wash around the rocks, while not eliminating the sky 100%, but giving it a nice little horizon line to fall that doesn't emphasis or focus on the sky. The other thing with the wide angle is, see up there in the upper right corner, I still leave a little bit of sky over the mountain. I like to do that, but some people might actually want to come a little bit lower and have that line sort of terminate the sky right into the mountain. Now I'm also trusting my in-camera level system just so I get that horizon nice and perfect. You want to do that because you want to make sure that it's not off. If your horizon line is a little bit off, if you don't check your in-camera level or use your guides, you're going to have a crooked horizon line. Now that is something that you never want to do in this type of photography because it's an easy indicator for anybody who's looking at the photo. They'll usually find the first mistake you've made, and anybody can see that horizon is off. So if you're not sure where the horizon is, you can't see it or use one of the leveling lines, go ahead and trust the in-camera level. It's going to be really close, if not perfectly accurate. So I'm shooting this right now at 16 millimeter, but let's say you don't have a 16 millimeter lens. Let's say you have something like an 18 to 24 or even a 24 millimeter. Let's see if we can still get something nice while zooming in a little bit. Okay, so here, let's look at the scene again. I'm set up at 16 millimeter. Let's go ahead and go to, let's say, 24, because a 24 to 70 is a pretty standard lens. Most of us can shoot at 24 millimeter. So while I am losing a little bit of that rock in the foreground, I'm actually getting a positive effect on this scene as well. Those little rock spires in the background are very, very interesting. So zooming in a little bit has cropped a little bit of the foreground, but has also created an emphasis now and put more attention towards those rocky spires in the background. So I really like that. So that's 24 millimeter and it still works. Let's go all the way to 35 and see if we can get something nice out of this scene. So again, the 16 to 35 is a really good scouting lens. But again, we can really be creative with whatever lens we happen to have. It doesn't have to be a full range. It can be a fixed 24 or 35. You should, with this kind of coastline, be able to get something really interesting. So let's lock it into an interesting composition here. So again, this is 35. I kind of like this composition. I liked it a little bit better at 24, I'm going to admit. 35 still nice. I have sort of this this big island on the bottom of the screen now has become sort of a rocky foreground element. Bear in mind that I'm shooting at 16 by 9 mode, so if we were shooting a photo, I'd actually get more of the top and bottom here. I'd be able to compose it a little bit differently, but we'll work with this wide aspect. Now, off to the left of the frame, I've decided to keep those little black rocks in the frame. The reason is I don't want to crop them. The white water is actually being caused by being, one, very windy and turbulent around rocks, so it's creating that whitewash effect, which is kind of nice. So if I wanted to capture a little bit more of that whitewash, I could actually start to ignore a little bit more of the shoreline and focus more on those rocks. And you can see that other rocks coming into focus here. So I think here you could get a really nice wide to medium shot. And even at 35, we can still get something nice. But in this case, it really worked best between 16 and 24. So instead of just sampling one area and trying different millimeters to see if I can get something I like, what I really like to do is explore the entire area. Now, while I like some shots here, I'm not sure if it's the best one or the one that I really want to come home with a shot from today. So what we're going to do is explore the coastline a little bit and see if we can find varying levels of composition or something that we like a little bit better. And I'm going to start by moving up the shore. Now, since we are on a shoreline, this is really interesting. The further we can get away from the shoreline, the more it's going to spread out that shoreline and give us sort of a longer composition. If I get closer to the shore, I'm going to compress that detail. It's going to actually compress the shoreline, so I'm going to be kind of looking down the shoreline instead. So I'm going to go up to the top, and I'm going to see what it looks like to look down that coastline. So we've moved a little bit further up the coastline and sort of wrapped around. We came from that way down there, about halfway down to the end. And now I'm just going to kind of explore and see if there's a better vantage point from up here. You never really know until you get above these rocks what they're going to look like when you get to that vantage point. So even though they may look like they're not going to be good from where you currently are, I always encourage people to explore as much as possible, because you're going to end up with a better shot if you really cancel out the areas that you like or don't like before you invest the time to get the shot that you really want. So let's take a look at this spot again. I've set it up again at 16 millimeter, and I'm just trying to find a composition that I really like. I'm still not 100% sold on it. I like the other position more, but I'm going to work a little bit. I'm going to try to maybe minimize the horizon line a little bit, so I'm going to bring the composition down a little bit, see if that adds a little bit more interest. And I think it does. It actually works pretty well for me. I'm just going to adjust it a little bit more. Basically looking for a nice balance of foreground rocks down here on the bottom of the frame that'll lead the eye through all these black rocks all the way up until the spires beyond. Again, my horizon is perfectly leveled, or at least that's what the camera's telling me it is, because it's easier for me to trust the camera than trust my eyes. Now, the spires look pretty good in the background. They're really small because I'm at 16 millimeter right now. What would happen if I move the camera to the right? Let's see if it gets any better. So I could maybe put those spires offset a little bit to the left instead. And now I'm really emphasizing on the land structure on the right. And personally, this is something that I wouldn't do. I really like that these are cliffs facing the sea. I also have a little bit of color in the sky on the left that breaks up the monotony of the 50% gray. So I really like compositions that focus on, one, the landscape, but also the water around it, shape of the waves coming in and that white water wash. So you see that white water wash in this kind of wide composition sort of leads the eye towards those spires again, because it's off to the left bottom and then almost across the center of the frame to the middle of the top, and actually leads the eye in. So we're creating sort of natural leading lines here with the land on one side and the water on the other. So again, this is 16 millimeter. I like to start wide and then zoom in so I can kind of see the total scene, because when I zoom in after it's wide, I already know what's around. I know where all the rocks are, and I kind of know what I can zoom in and crop and get rid of. All right, so let's go again. And this time, rather than locking it at 24 millimeter, I'm just going to zoom in until I find something that I kind of like. And let's try to get rid of that entire foreground rock right there and see what happens if we zoom in here all the way. Something like that. Again, very level horizon. And let's check and see. This is just about 28 millimeter, and I'm starting to find something that I like here. So again, I've minimized the sky, I've zoomed in, I've made more of an emphasis on those spires in the background, and now I have a leading line through the center of the frame with these black rocks that sort of pebble their way all the way to the background. Still have a little bit of ground on the right here, and I still have some black rocks and some of the water wash on the left. So from here, there are a few things we could do, and then this is going to be sort of personal preference of where exactly you want to frame those spires. I'm going to choose to not put them exactly in the center. I'm going to put them a little bit off center to the right and just start adjusting. So even a composition like this, I really like. Maybe even move it up a little bit more and offset. And this looks really, really visually pleasing to me as well. Just as the last thing we'll do here is we'll zoom all the way in, and this is the extent of my 35. And you guys can see that even at 35, this wide 16 by 9 crop, we can still get something that looks pretty nice. And see off to the left there's that little rock just about to get exposed, a little black speck in the bottom left. I'm going to get rid of that. I just don't like to crop objects. I want to make sure that I don't crop any of those rocks. So now it's gone, and I actually end up with another black rock that's not cropped that makes a nice composition element in the lower left third of the frame. So I have a situation now where I like both views. So in these situations, I might spend the time to go ahead and capture something that I really like from this location, move down to the other location and a few more, and capture some different versions. Sometimes when you're in the field, you might like something, but when you get into post-processing and you see these really big, when you blow them up on your 27-inch iMac or whatever large screen you have, or even on a 15-inch MacBook Pro, you're going to see all of that detail that you kind of missed looking through the little LCD screen. So if you think you like multiple compositions, there's no reason why you can't shoot them all and decide later which one was your favorite. So the sun's doing something a little bit different. Since we have really short days, the sun never just rises and goes across the top of the sky. This time of year in Iceland, it actually rises and creates this slow arc where it never really hits a high altitude in the sky. So normally, say you were on the meridian or you're on the equator, the sun rises and sets, and the sunrise and sunset may last about 15 minutes, and you might have that great light. Here at Iceland, since the rise and decline of the sun is so slow, it stays in an arc pattern and keeps the clouds nice colors. It keeps the light really soft throughout the day. It really gives you, with those short days, the whole day to capture really nice lighting. Here in this situation now, we have too thick of a cloud cover, so the sun's never really going to light the day more than it is right now, which is really interesting. So this is, right now, winter Iceland with this cloud cover. This is full day. So on a day like today, when we have a low sun and soft filtered light, you can effectively shoot multiple vantage points using this light because the conditions are going to stay the same throughout the day. So unless you have something completely specific that you want to work on, one specific shot that you're trying to target, you can really use your time to get multiple shots in this lighting scenario. So now that we've taken a look at two different compositions, one high and one mid, I'm going to walk all the way down to the tip of that cape there, looking back at the coastline to see how the composition changes. So now I'm set up all the way in the tip of this area that we can access, as far as we can go away from the cliff line here. And I'm starting again at 16 millimeters so I can see the full frame here. And I've set this frame up in particular at 16 millimeter to emphasize what I really like to use in shots like this. Since I'm now further away from the cliff, I can use some of the rocks that I'm standing on as really nice foreground elements. So today, remember I said it's not all about the sky, it's more about the foreground, so we might as well start to incorporate some of those foreground elements. And here, they start to lead the eye through the frame. So if you start in the bottom left, all the way to the bottom right, you can see the shape of the mountain wraps around sort of a semicircle and then up across the frame into those spires. There's nothing in the frame that's centered. Everything's a little bit off. There's still a little bit of sky, plenty of foreground. I really like this shot. Few things that we could do to it a little bit different. We could actually move the camera down a little bit. And again, this is 16 by 9, so I'm losing a little bit. But what happens if I frame more of the rocky foreground? Let me make sure that my horizon is perfectly leveled. It's a little windy, so it'll take me a second to get here. Perfect. Now this composition is also really acceptable. I love the rocky foreground. I also like how we can see the complete semicircle of water wash around that big stone in the center. So you can see nothing comes off the frame. We don't crop any of that rock, so it's really, really nice. So again, now that I'm at 16, let's see what happens when I zoom. Just in case you have an 18 or a 24 lens, let's see what you're able to get. So if we stop emphasizing so much on the foreground, start zooming in, we start to really come into the details of that background. And in this case, this whole area, I think, is named after those spires. So it's kind of nice to have them be predominant in the frame itself. So something like this is a little bit more medium. It's about 22 millimeter. I'll go all the way up to 24 just so we can see what the standard setting would look like. So here at 24 millimeter, you can frame something a little bit like this, I think, looks pretty good. We still get enough of the water wash. We have this really interesting foreground element in the bottom left, and we get everything with a little bit of the horizon line on the top leading into those spires. I think for this shot to really work, though, I think my favorite would be somewhere between 16 and 20 millimeters. So let me frame something that I'd really look for here. And I'm just going to go all the way to about 16, and then I'm going to zoom in just a little bit. Maybe crop just a hair. So I think I'd settle on something like that. Oh, it's not all the way zoomed out. It's not all the way zoomed in. It has a nice foreground interest on the bottom, really nice leading lines. I'm really fascinated by this semicircle of water that's going around this boulder. I think it just adds a lot to the composition and makes it very, very interesting. So let's say we had an epic sunset back there. With a composition like this, I still don't think I'd emphasize the sky because the foreground is really, really important. But let's just see what it would look like if I started to raise the camera up a little bit. So I'm going to go back to 16 millimeter and I'm going to start raising the camera up. So really quickly, it's still an interesting composition, but we've lost so much of those incredible details in the foreground. So we could still get away with something like this, but the sky would have to be so impressive that it becomes more important than the visual elements of the rock. So if the sky was just exploding with colors and light, I'd probably find about a third of the frame max of the sky. So I could still emphasize all of the rich details and textures in the foreground. But with a shot like this, so visually interesting with all of the rocks in the foreground, we really don't need a sky to make a beautiful shot. And I'm kind of thankful for that because it allows me to focus on these foreground elements, these beautiful colors and details and textures of the rocks. So out of the 3 spots that we've looked at, this is by far my favorite. It's also, there's this really nice rocky ground here, so it's the perfect place to set up and do some longer exposures because I'm not set up on grass. When you set up on grass, the tripod can be a little bit shaky, and since we have really, really cranking wind today, this is the most stable surface that I've found, and conveniently enough, it's also my favorite composition. For this shot, I'm going to freeze the water in time. I'm going to use f8, ISO 200, and in aperture priority mode, the camera has selected 1/50 for my shutter speed. Let's see what that looks like. So as you can see with this shot, we managed to mostly freeze the water in time. We also caught sort of a wave crashing over that black rock in the lower left. So everything looks pretty good. But I think we can do a little bit better just by dragging the shutter. And what that's going to do, it's going to soften the water a little bit. It's not going to make it to one of those softened waterscapes. But what it's going to do is create this soft effect around the whitewash. So it's going to give some directionality to the white streaks in the water. So in this tutorial, we're going to get more complicated and we're going to start using neutral density filters to be able to control how much light is entering the camera and to be able to drag our shutters to really, really long times. Since we're still at the beginning of this tutorial, I'd like to keep things pretty simple and I want to just use everything I have in camera to see how far I can drag the shutter. So for this next shot, I'm going to turn my ISO all the way down. That's past its native 64, all the way down to low 1.0, which actually means ISO 50. I'm going to leave the f-stop at f8, and it looks like that gives me a shutter speed of 1/6 of a second. So we'll take this photo and we'll see what the difference is. So if we take a look at this exposure, and we compare it to the other one real quick, we'll notice that the new exposure that had a 1/6 of a second shutter speed is a little bit softer around the water, but we also notice that it doesn't look that much different because it wasn't that much different. What changed was the water itself. So the water is so turbulent right now that it makes it kind of hard to tell between a medium exposure and a fast exposure. So I've already turned the ISO all the way down to as low as possible. Now the only thing I can change now in camera to try to drag the shutter speed is the f-stop. So I'm going to take it from f8 and bring it all the way up to f22. Now that I've changed the f-stop to f22 with a low ISO of 1.0 or ISO 50, I get a 1.3 second exposure. Now that should make a major difference to the waves. Okay, so let's take a look at this new shot here and let's zoom in. And yeah, we can really see down in the lower right in that little semicircle where all that water wash is, you can really see how those white streaky water lines are making really interesting compositional elements. So I really like this. It's not super soft, but it's just soft enough to add little details in the shot itself. So just to recap a little bit, if you want to soften the water a little bit when it's this turbulent and you don't have any filters, you want to do it all in camera, what you can do is turn your f-stop all the way up. Most lenses support f22. You can turn your ISO down all the way. A lot of cameras support 100 or even a low 50, and you can get a longer exposure that way. Now bear in mind that the light is still really subdued out here, so we're able to push things to a 1.3 second exposure. That's a pretty slow exposure considering it's daytime. If that sun were fully out and we had a really bright condition, we would not be able to get a 1 second exposure. We'd need an additional camera filter, a neutral density filter on the front of our camera to be able to mitigate the amount of light that's coming in. In a future chapter of this video, I'm going to be covering how to use neutral density filters as well as neutral density grads to be able to control the amount of light that's coming into your camera and dramatically change the length of the shutter. So this was a pretty simple location to photograph. Now let's go into Photoshop and tie it all together. Here we are again, post-processing lesson number 2 in Iceland, the Londrangar cliffs, the basalt cliffs that we shot. So the first thing that I'm going to do is go to lesson 2. I'm going to expand lesson 2, and I'm going to open up the Lightroom catalog for lesson 2. Inside of Lightroom, it's going to look pretty much the same, but we're going to have different raw files to work with. Now, this lesson in the field had a lot to do with composition, so I probably overshot this location more than I usually do. So instead of giving you guys tons of raw files that we aren't going to use, I went ahead and focused on a few different variations. So if you remember back from the lesson in the field, it wasn't just about finding the composition, but it was about maxing out the extent of the in-camera capabilities of getting softer water and slightly blurry water effects. So let's take a look at what I have here. Now, basically I have an underexposed version and a neutrally exposed version of each file, so I'm just going to go ahead and select these so that we can audition them and see which one we like the most. First thing that I'm really going to look for is composition. So as I look through these, that one goes to soft water. I'm really going to see which composition I like. So I really have 3 to choose from. This perspective, and this perspective. I pretty much think that I like this one the best. I think it has a really nice leading line in the foreground, the rocks. They move all the way back into these pinnacle spires in the background. Beautiful water wash all the way through here in this great rock in the foreground that we talked about in the lesson. But I also shot it at a slightly longer exposure. So this one, you can see the settings up here on the right. That is f18, a low ISO of 31 actually, which is the lowest setting in the Nikon D810, and 0.6 second exposure. If I go to this one, the one that's exposed a little bit more, you can see that I have 1.3 seconds at f18, and it's exactly the same otherwise. But look what happens in the water here. Now this is something that looks really, really cool. If we look at this one that was a shorter exposure, I just get a little bit of wash. This is kind of streaky over here to the right, but I don't like it as much as this one. On this one, we have these little tendrils of water seem to be grabbing onto this rock. I really like the way this looks, and this is the one I think that we're going to work on. Now, I've
also made it green here so you guys can find it very quickly and easily. But feel free to do this to any file that you want. That's why I've included all the raw files so that you guys can pick and choose, rebuild the lesson with me, or build your own version of the lesson. With the raw file selected, I'm going to go ahead and make my adjustments. Here everything looks really good. I'm disappointed because the sky, again, very blown out. Foreground darks, shadows look pretty good. If I go down to the underexposed version, you can see I'm starting to get that sky back. So the first thing I'm going to do is try to balance the foreground. So right now the shadows and everything look pretty good. I'm going to pull the highlights down and see if I can start to get some of the sky back. And I am pulling the sky back a little bit, but it's going to need a little bit more adjustment on that end just to get it back fully. So I'm going to pull the exposure down just a hair to pull the sky back, and I'm also going to increase the shadows. Now, it's very important. By changing the lightness in the sky to get some of the details back, I've also been able to get some of the details back in the water, but that's very important. At this point, what I really want to do is I want to pull down the highlights in the sky even more so that I can get what little texture I had in the sky. The thing is I don't really want to take it away from the foreground. There are some highlights in the landscape and in the foreground that I'm going to take away if I keep pulling those highlights down too much. So this is the first time I'm going to show you guys how to use selective editing tools inside of Lightroom. So what we're going to do is create a selective gradient to use. I'm going to go up here, I'm going to click the gradient tool, and when I click the gradient tool, I'm going to be able to click and drag the effect and where I want it. So basically, if I click and drag and I hold Shift, I can create the area that I want to affect. I'm going to redo that one more time just in case you guys didn't see it. It's right here. If I click it, it'll allow me to make a new selection, and then again, once I click and drag, it'll be the area that I select. Right now it has some default settings, there's not too much happening, but if I change these options now, let's say I pull the exposure way down, you can see that I'm just affecting the sky. I'm going to leave this severely dramatic so we can see how this works. Basically, this is the center point for the gradient ramp, and this is the fall off from the top and the bottom. So the wider this is, the wider and longer the fall off. So what I want to do is position this a little bit so that I start to get the sky back without really hurting the cliff face, and I'm going to bring this up. Right now it looks horrible, but that's just so you guys can see what I'm trying to do. I'm going to bring that back to about 0. I'm going to cancel it out using the keyboard, and I'm going to take the highlights down a little bit more. So here's a way that I can take the highlights down in the sky independently of the foreground, which is really nice. If I click on this again, it's going to hide it, and it's still going to be in effect, and I can still change things here. So notice how this has missing data right here. I don't want to clamp these levels here. I actually want to bring that right to the edge because I'm losing some of the detail in the cliff. And it was really soft lighting. I want to retain all the highlights and the shadows. I'm just going to bring the whites back a little bit, and that's just going to slide it up. Well, the great thing is that I've already pulled that down in the sky selectively, so now I can make my adjustments to the foreground without complicating the sky, just because I've done it separately. So that's a really easy way to do this stuff a little bit selectively. So I'm just going to make the final tweaks before we go into Photoshop. I'm also going to increase the vibrance just a little bit because we lost some of those beautiful tones. Actually, we have greens, yellows, browns, tan colors, all sorts of rich detail that's just waiting to be pulled out here. Again, remember, before we go back into Photoshop, I'm going to take the sharpening down, enable profile corrections, remove chromatic aberrations. Now, one more thing that I might do, at this point I could change the temperature a little bit. I could warm this up, I could cool it down. We're going to start doing this more often in the next few videos, but I just want to show you guys, when you shoot your white balance and you pick a custom white balance or an auto white balance, the nice thing is your in-camera white balance is important for establishing your shots, but you can always change it later in post. And when I say that in the field and you guys say it doesn't really matter because we can do it in post, this is how we do it. This is our Kelvin temperature that we set automatically in the camera using the auto mode or manually. And you can see I can actually change that here. So if there's any errors in that, if you shot it incorrectly, you don't like the balance, you can always change that here. For the sake of simplicity, we're going to leave it as shot, and we're going to work with this file. Next step is to get this into Photoshop. So I'm going to right-click the image, say Export. I could say Export with Previous, but I'm just going to do Export one more time so we can see the settings. I have it set to a temp directory. Image format's going to be PSD. I'm working at ProPhoto. Again, feel free to work whatever your comfortable working space is, Adobe RGB. 8 bits to cut the file size down. If this is a portfolio image for you guys, definitely work at 16. And all the way on the bottom here, it's going to open automatically in Photoshop 2014. When I click export, it's going to ask me if I want to overwrite because I've done this before. In this case, I'm going to overwrite, but usually I would use unique names. The only reason you see this is because I've done this lesson before I started recording it. So I'm just going to overwrite it, and we're going to open it in Photoshop. Here we are again in Photoshop. The next thing that I'm going to do is the same thing I did with the last file, but before that, we need to do a little bit of adjustment. So I want to change the contrast, I want to amplify the colors, I want to really accentuate the water and all these beautiful details that we have. But first we have some issues. Number one, that horizon is not straight. So my rulers are up right now. If the rulers were hidden, which they are now, and I did Command R on the keyboard, the rulers would come up. With rulers enable, I can change, I can slide down a guide here and actually just put it right next to the horizon. You can see all of that in-camera leveling that I talked about, all of that careful effort to monitor the inside of the camera, obviously didn't work so well here, so I'm going to have to adjust this myself. In order to do that, I have to change the background layer, double-click on it, turn it into a regular layer, and I'm going to use a transform. So I'm going to hit Command-T on the keyboard for transform, and that's going to give me the ability to rotate this image and fix the horizon. I really would have liked if this was perfect to begin with, but it's really easy to change. And again, I can pull more guides down and just see if I'm close, pretty close, needs a little bit more tweaking, just a hair here, and that looks pretty good. Hit return, it'll bake that in. I'm going to go ahead and clear this guide just by removing it and putting it back on the ruler. Now I'm going to have some border problems, so I'm going to pick the crop tool, and I'm just going to crop these little bits off. I'm going to clear any formatting that's on the crop, and I'm going to go ahead and just manually pull in some of these edges here. So I'm just getting rid of those areas. You can see that I'm actually losing quite a few pixels around each edge, and I can be really careful to make sure that I don't lose too much just by being really careful about what I do crop. But automatically, by fixing the horizon, you can see that I've lost a few little percentages of this image, which is kind of heartbreaking. It's 36 megapixels. I've probably just lost just a little bit. So when I hit return, it's going to crop everything down, and we're ready to go. The next thing I want to talk about are these dust spots. And if I zoom in here, you can really see these things. They're starting to look really bad. This is a side effect of shooting with a high f-stops. Once we get up to around f16, f18, f22, this is going to show more and more, and it's actually little dust spots or water spots that are on my sensor or on my lens. So if we shoot at f8 or f11 like I usually do, then I don't get these spots. But if I shoot around f22, then I definitely get these spots. So we have to figure out a way to remove them. And the easiest way to remove them is to zoom in and pick the selective healing brush, or the spot healing brush. We just click the brush, and I actually get a brush size that comes up, and I can change that brush size on the keyboard by using my bracket keys. And you can see that that brush size will change. And all I do with content aware selected, sample all layers, I'm actually just going to click and create a spot over the water spot. And you can see that these just start to disappear. Now unfortunately, I actually have to manually go in here and select each one of these things. And every time that I do that, it reminds me that I really do need to clean my sensor more often. And when you travel to places like Iceland, New Zealand, or just dusty places like Petra and Jordan, you're going to notice that these climates and changing your lenses in the field is just going to accumulate tons and tons of dust. So if you can take my advice, clean your camera regularly so you don't have to deal with this. And later on in this tutorial, we're going to be using neutral density filters shot at different f-stops that avoid f22 so that we don't have to do this unnecessary cleanup. Another thing you have to be careful of is you may start to try to remove dust spots that are actually on your monitor and not in the image. I do this all the time on my MacBook Pro because it always gathers dust. I find myself removing things that aren't actually there. So I'm going to do the best job I can just so we don't have to take up too much time here. And the sky is where you're really going to notice these things, like really going to notice them. But in the foreground, in these rocks, we might not notice them so much, but we may have some issues in the water itself. So you can see there's a couple black spots. I don't know if that's a black spot from the camera sensor or it's just a black thing in the water, but I'll go ahead and get rid of it. And right now we can see that there's probably a few that I can't see, but at least the ones in the sky are gone. So as we work, I try to get them all at the beginning, but sometimes I miss a few. Water spots are almost cleaned up, and the horizon has been pretty much leveled. It's definitely better than it was. It was very off before. So the next step is to take it into Color Effects Pro, just like we did last time, and apply some contrast. So go to Nik Collection, Color Effects Pro. Here in Color Effects Pro, remember that it always applies whatever your last correction was. So I'm going to go over here to the left, and I'm going to pick Pro Contrast. I use Pro Contrast all the time. It's my favorite way to add dynamic contrast. So let's turn that up a little bit. Let's start to amplify the details a little bit. Let's also correct the contrast so that I can get some of the rich blacks and whites back into the image. I like the way that looks. I'm going to toggle it on and off so that we can see the difference. Pull back on it just a hair. Add another filter. Next thing I want to do is add a contrast color range, just like we did with the last file. Again, this one comes in a little wonky, so we have to fix it, zero it out a little bit again, toggle the brightness just to the left and the right. It'll reset. Then we can add some color contrast. And again, really take notice of the areas that have some light. The sun is off to this direction. It's filtered by the clouds, but we're still getting soft lights casting onto the rock here. And when I start to use this color contrast, it creates some more contrast in those color ranges and makes it look like it's lit a little bit more, which is what I want here. I want to get rid of some of the soft light and start replacing it with some stronger, more defined light. Add one more filter, and these are the three that we've used before. Polarization again, if I change the strength, notice two things. That the sky will start to blueing up a little bit, and also we'll have some aqua colors here in the water. Again, before, after, and now we're getting some of that rich detail and color contrast. Again, just do this to taste and say, okay. That looks pretty good. We've gone from a balanced raw to a very dynamic, contrasty image. You see that we got all this detail back in the sky? Looking at the raw file, I would have never known that was there until I started to recover it. So let's see what we can do here. Now, this scene is really cool. It's very dramatic. It's a crazy coastline. These are really high cliffs, very high winds. I think it was blowing about 30 to 40 knots that day. You couldn't hear it on the microphone when we were recording, but it was really strong. Water's washing. We got this dynamic effect in the water, these very hard cliffs, and everything looks good, but I want it to have more pop and have a little bit more drama to maintain the drama part of the image. So we're going to go back into Color Effects Pro, and I'm going to teach you guys one more filter that adds a lot of drama to your images. Filter I want to show you guys next is called Tonal Contrast. So we used Pro Contrast, was dynamic contrast. Tonal Contrast makes things look crazy. Look at the default setting before and after. It almost makes it look like an HDR gone bad. So right off the bat, that should tell us that 2550, 2520, those values are too high. I'm going to zero them out all the way. And we're going to add these selectively. What would happen if we added midtones liberally? And what happens if we would add shadows here liberally? We're getting a lot of detail out. But I'll tell you what if I just wanted to accentuate the details in the sky? Let's say I didn't want to accentuate any of the details in this foreground because I feel it's dramatic enough, but I feel that the sky is pretty weak. Well, let's say that these settings are the ones that I went with. That's how I wanted the sky to look. So I have tonal contrast before and after. So it's getting some negative effects here in the foreground, making it a little bit too rough, a little bit too HDR look. So I want to get rid of that, but I want to keep all the details in the sky. At this point, I don't want to introduce masking quite yet. We're going to do that in a few minutes. So I want to show you guys a quick and easy way to do things selectively inside of Nik software using something called U-point technology. U-points function under the control point menu. And if I expand those, you can see that I also have a plus and a minus. So I click on the plus, and let's say I click on the sky, watch what happens. Now it'll remove the selection anywhere else. What if I add another one right next to it in the sky? Now, take a look at this. Off and on, I'm only selecting the sky. Now this is powerful already, but what is this actually doing? Click on the mask button, and now we can see a black and white representation, white being selected, black being not selected. So if I start to add more of these points now, and we'll enable them here, you can see that I'm actually selecting the sky. Just like anything in Adobe products, if I hold the Option with the arrow key enabled and drag, I can duplicate these points. So right now the sky is selected. Let's create some negative ones. Let's say I don't want it in the mountain here, I don't want it in the mountain here, I definitely don't want it in the water. and I can just start removing some of these areas here. And I can scale them, I can duplicate them, and before I know it, I can have just the sky selected. Now if I turn this off, global toggle being clicking that mask button again and again, now I just have tonal contrast in the sky. So I can adjust this a little bit more in the shadows, adjust this a little bit more in the midtones, and now I get all of that detail back in the sky without manipulating anything in the foreground. So I'm just going to go ahead and apply this. This is one selective tonal contrast. Selective because we've only used these points to select the sky. With no points, it would be a global correction. Let's apply it. Say OK. The more points you add, the more time it'll take to render your color effects. Here we have our selective result. So pay particular attention to the sky. We have sky before and sky after, and now we have nice little detail. We have these great opposing lines here. So we have all these lines here, leading lines through the frame here, across the top of the sky, through the water. It's starting to look really cool. The next thing that I want to do is sharpening. And again, I want to use a high pass filter. So I'll duplicate this layer with a Command J, go to Filter, Other, High Pass. I'm going to pick 3 just like I did last time, and I'm going to say OK, set this to overlay, and I'll zoom in here and we'll take a look at what it's doing to this image. So we have high pass on and off. So you can see all those little details, all these little pebbles here, these little edges on the rocks have now been chiseled out, almost as if it was blurry to begin with, which we know it wasn't. But check this out. There's a side effect to doing this to the water. Check out the ripple lines here in the water. I spent all this time in camera trying to get my water to be soft, that the last thing that I want to do is sharpen it back up using a high pass filter. So if I turn this off and on, you can see that all these lines that should be soft in the water now also get hardened too. So I don't want that to happen. Just like we applied the tonal contrast selectively, now we're going to learn how to apply the high pass filter selectively by using a mask. And masks are really easy to use. And I'm going to show you guys how to use them and how to paint your masks on selectively. Before I get into showing you guys how to use masking, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the paintbrush tool. I'm going to create a new layer and I'm going to fill that layer with white. So it's going to look a little bit boring. I'm going to pick a color that works. Let's pick red, for example. And I'm going to select the brush tool. Now you can change the brush size again by using the brackets just like we did when we used the spot healing brush. But I have something that's set up and it's a little bit more useful. Since I'm using this Wacom Intuos small tablet and a stylus, I have some keys set up. So just like you paint, I can paint by pressing down on the button here, but I also have 2 additional express key buttons built into this. And I also have one built into the button on the bottom here that allows me to hold, and when I press in Photoshop to the right and to the left, my brush size will get smaller and larger. If I go up and down, it'll actually get harder and softer. It's really useful. The hotkeys for this are actually Control, Option, and Click. And if I show you guys how this is set up in my system preferences, it's really easy to bind keys with the Wacom tablet. So really quickly, I want to show you guys, when you're in the pen function, you have the first thing is tip feel. You see current pressure. I have it set to medium, and you can see the harder I press, the harder that detail will exceed. So basically I have like medium pressure, so I can do light to medium to hard just with a little bit of pressure. If you really want to crank this thing down, you can turn it to firm, different things like that. And you can also see that I have this button set to right click and this one set to a modifier. When I have modifier, I just have it Control Option. That's how I'm able to change the brush size inside of Photoshop. So it's really useful. So I'm going to pick a medium size brush here, medium size, hardness, and let's talk a little bit about how opacity works versus flow. So the first thing that I want to talk about is opacity, and I'm going to turn these things off. Right now, if I have this opacity set to 100 and I click and drag, I'm going to get 100% opacity on this brush. If I turn the opacity down to 50% and I click and drag, the max I'm going to get is 50% opacity. There'll be no accumulation. If I let go and press again, I'm going to get 50% on top of that. That's still not really that great. I want to take advantage of this pressure sensitivity on this pen. I want to be able to brush in my effects subtly and really take advantage of this paint thing here, because I've been using a tablet since 1999. I stopped using a mouse, and ever since then I've been able to do these complex things with really simple brush strokes. So let's go ahead and white this out again, and we're going to talk about flow instead of opacity. So I'm going to turn the opacity back up all the way, and I'm going to enable flow. Flow is really interesting because if I click on this icon to the left, this will allow me to use accumulation. So enable airbrush style buildup effects. Actually, this is really easy. If I roll over any of these options, it'll tell me exactly what they are. So always use pressure for opacity. When off, brush preset controls pressure. So this is nice. I want to use the pressure. So what happens now if I have the opacity set to 100 and the flow set to 100, I press really lightly. Well, now I'm getting a really light brush, and you can see the harder I press, the more paint it puts down. So I can go soft, really soft, all the way to hard. Now we're starting to be able to use the brush, a paintbrush, the way that it's intended. So this is going to become very powerful. The nice thing right now is I have the flow and opacity set to 100, so I have to be very careful to not press too hard. Let me clear this out one more time. I tend to work with my flow right around 10 to 25%. 10 being so that I can push a little bit harder and get these really nice accumulation effects when I'm painting on masks. This is going to come in really handy for the rest of the things that we do right now. So let me go ahead and zero this out, and I just want to show you guys really quick. We have the express key bound to the pen here. Click right to left, size, up, down, hardness, and if you use the number keys on the keyboard, 1 is 10% flow all the way up, 5 is 50, 6 is 60. Hit 5 twice, it'll be 55%. So you have these really great hotkeys that you can change this. So what does this mean? Well, right now I've been painting on a white layer. Well, let's go ahead and create a mask. Well, let's forget about this right now, but let me go ahead and create a mask. I'm going to turn everything off except for this layer, so that if I turn this layer off, it'll be invisible. And I'm going to create a new mask. And I'm going to do that by clicking the mask button down here. It's going to create a white mask. White and masking means 100% visible, just like those U points I showed you did too. Same thing. Black is hidden, white is fully opaque. So right now, no brainer, white is fully opaque. If I do a Command I to invert this, black is going to be fully gone. It's gone. White is visible. But I want to do percentages of that. So let's say if this is a black mask, Command I, and I want to paint some of this image back in, I can switch my palette from black to white, and this palette is basically foreground, background color. I'm going to teach you guys one more hotkey now. X on the keyboard swaps it, so I can toggle from painting white to black. So I'm going to paint white here, and if I start painting on this mask, you can see I'm going to start revealing the image behind it over a transparency. So this is really powerful right now. I can just basically reveal part of this image. So this is nice. I mean, kind of looks like, you know, our first postcard we've created together with this extremely exaggerated vignette. But you can see the mask here, and the mask looks like this. It's basically black to white. Any variations of this are just going to be different transparency. Really, really easy to use. So I'm going to get rid of this mask because, well, it's not really that interesting at all. It's just for display purposes. And I'm going to go back to this tonal contrast copy that I turned into a high-pass filter, and I'm going to turn it back on. I'm going to create a mask. Now, I love it everywhere around here. I kind of like it down here. I don't want it in the water. So I can go ahead and select this mask, use black, pick a flow of about 60%, and I can just start painting black to remove it. And right now it's kind of hard to see. If I let go here, we're going to start to see that mask. But I still can't really see what I'm painting on. If I hold the option, I can click on the mask and I can see it. But again, I can't see the image behind it, so it's going to be really hard to work with. So instead, I'm going to go back to this layer and select the mask. And I am going to hit the / key on the keyboard, and that's going to enable Quick Mask Mode. Inside of Quick Mask Mode, I get a red overlay that shows me the area that I'm painting on. So I can really quickly just paint out the sky. Now, this is paint. It's really nice. This is a layer basically over top of itself with an effect. So anytime I go over actual geometry here, I wouldn't worry about it. We're just trying to smooth out and get rid of that water. Because just as it's texturing the water, any noise in the sky, that high-pass filter will pick it up. I'm going to use the button on my Wacom stylus again so that I can go right in here and just get rid of that softness. But why spend all that time softening your water if Photoshop's just going to sharpen it again? So we want to make sure that we keep all that nice and clean. When you're done, Quick Mask Mode can be toggled off the same way by hitting the / key. All in all, I think this file is starting to look really good. There's some more things that we can do to it, but I kind of want to wait. As a reference, as I usually like to do, let's go back into Lightroom. I'm going to hold Option, click to reset tone, and I'm going to bring this in so we can compare it to the final result. So I'm going to export with previous. I'll say use unique names. I don't want to overwrite my own PSD. This time I'm going to show you guys how to get this file into another file. So we have two Photoshop files open, and we have one that's just a single image. This is kind of what I call a hotkey shuffle. First thing that we're going to do is use Command A on the keyboard for select all, Command C for copy, and Command W for close. Next thing we're going to do is Command V for paste, and that's going to paste that layer into the document. But you can also see that since we changed the horizon and we did some cropping, it's not going to match up entirely. But that's okay. It'll still give us a reference point and something that we can look at. So this was straight out of camera. This was the adjusted raw with the horizon fix. This was color effects and sharpening at the end. So we've basically gone from this to this. So not so bad. And again, we're going to go over some more advanced stuff as these chapters progress. So that wraps it up for the Londrangar Cliffs. The next place we're going to work on is Godafoss Waterfall.